Greetings, viewers. Welcome to New Australian Bulletin in one of our infrequent video bulletins. Just a little bit of a word about that. YouTube is throttling us. Twitter is throttling us. So we will be more present upon Rumble and BitChute from here on in. But if you want to check us out, we do a lot of writing at www.newaustralianbulletin.com. And a regular guest tonight, we have Britain's legendary premier nationalist, Nick Griffin, speaking to us all the way from Ireland. And we've got one of the founders of modern Australian nationalism, as usual, Dr. Jim Saleam.
Good evening, gentlemen.
Hello to both of you.
Good evening.
Now, I'm going to throw this first bit over to Jim here, because he's got an interesting little thing to raise with you. Jim?
Yes, Nick. One of our members here sent us a remarkable piece out of a book that actually concerns yourself. And it's written by an Israeli journalist called Nadav Eyal. And he's written a book called The Worldwide Uprising Against Globalization. It's a 2021 book. Are you aware of this book?
I'm not, no.
Right. Well, look, in this remarkable piece of work, he says that he interviewed you back in 2008, and he interviewed Barack Obama. And he said that essentially, if I could paraphrase this man without doing him an injustice, he said that Obama's a bit of a Pollyanna character, talking about the wonderful future of liberalism. And he called yourself much more prescient in looking at matters of the financial crisis and of the inherent weakness that was in liberalism. And wow. He said, coming forward more than a decade now, he's more or less saying that you got it right and Barack Obama got it very wrong.
Now, can I ask you, I must make a note of that. What's that book called?
Okay, it's actually called The Worldwide Uprising Against Globalization by Nadav Eyal, E-Y-A-L. I've seen his name somewhere or other in Middle East journalism. And you may obviously, I know at that time you were being interviewed quite a lot, and he may have passed you by. But he referred specifically to things like the financial crisis, which I know a lot of people said a lot about. So what I'd like to do is just ask you for, before we get on with regular questioning and answering here, ask you for a comment on the idea of liberalism actually being a lot weaker than it was seen by even those who were its protagonists.
Yeah, well, when I was talking back then, I vaguely remember the fellow. I remember he was a very intelligent and unusually sort of open-minded interviewer. So it was very interesting. But things have moved on a great deal since then. So in 2008, talking about the crisis of liberalism and its connection with the whole financial system, the two, as you know, are absolutely intertwined. So in 2008, and for years before that, when we were criticizing it, it was primarily on, or saying this thing is going to be finished, it was primarily on the old nationalist position that the whole fiat money system, the whole banking system, is so impossibly corrupt and self-devouring that sooner or later it's going to reach a point where it simply can't go any further and they're going to be in terrible trouble. So that was primarily at that stage what I would have been saying. I think things have moved on now, and there's two factors. One of them is the one which I'm sure I've mentioned on the show before, that in the past you had an elite, and if they fouled things up, or rather when they fouled things up economically, and financially, it was a combination of the corruption of the system, the fundamental flaws of the system, their own corruption, and from time to time their incompetence. Whereas the elite we now have, when they foul things up, it's because they are deliberately destroying vast areas of the means of production and distribution and exchange. So that makes things even worse for liberalism, and it's a pointer as to why this cannot go on, because they're pulling out Jenga sticks from a big pile a big Jenga pile, and sooner or later, they'll pull out one too many. But on top of that, of course, we also got the old financial instability, which is so much worse than 2008, because as you, and I'm sure a lot of your viewers, if not all of them really will know, in 2008, after that financial crisis, they simply turned the printing presses on and created money to get themselves out of that hole. And they pretty much, and then they can't do that anymore. So where the crisis in 2008 was at some stage, you could say liberalism and the system that sustains it will not go on forever. We're now at a stage when we've got the financial crisis back on a mega scale, but they've already sort of blown. If they now print or allow more money to be created electronically, then they crash the dollar, they crash the financial system. And on top of that, you've got this deliberate destruction of the whole thing anyway. The only question now, I think, is no longer is liberalism and the financial capitalist system nearing its end. The only question now is the extent to which it's a result of just what they're doing and the system itself, but they don't want it to end, or in fact, to what extent and what proportion of the elite is now already thinking, well, we can take advantage of this massive crash that's coming to use it to impose the central bank digital currencies, and all the rest of it. And to what extent that is really part of the plan, or just them looking desperately for a way to pull their chestnuts out of the fire, we can't really tell. But certainly, the comparison between 2008 and now, you can only say now is 100 times worse and 100 times more dangerous and 100 times more fatal for their system.
Okay, well, getting into the capital of that disaster, events are really taking an epochal turn in the USA with Donald Trump and the absolutely laughable case that is being put against him. And it seems to be like a last desperate throes of that globalist system, because Donald Trump does represent protectionism, and he does represent the hated America first. Now, it begs the question: the desperados of the Democrat faith. I mean, where is it they want to go? We're at the last stage, tyranny. What are your thoughts? Because it's very important for the world, because due to Joe Biden, where the criminal Joe Biden, I mean, you only have to read Miranda Devine's excellent book, Laptop from Hell, to just absolutely get an insight into how inconceivably corrupt. I mean, it brings to mind the worst excesses of ancient Roman oligarchy. It's that replete, I should say, with the degeneracy, as we know. What are your thoughts, Nick, about what's unfurling there?
I think it's quite astounding, actually, because if they simply replace Biden with someone younger with a bit of, something about them, how on earth would he not beat Donald Trump, apart from the financial mess that they're in? But given that Trump really achieved nothing last time, what would they expect to achieve, years down the line when he's older? They've had even more time to surround him with, their people and people who keep him in a dead end. So I can't really see what the fuss is, other than it's a sort of knee-jerk, irrational hysteria, because with the demographic shift in the USA, plus I don't think that the US election was stolen quite as much as a lot of grassroots Republicans think. The reason that they think it was stolen is that they can't really grasp the demographic change and the political impact of it that already happened in the USA. But nevertheless, I've seen the Democrats' political machine up close and personal, because they taught the Labour Party when they were dealing with the BNP. Yeah. And it is immensely corrupt, and the whole the voting system they tailor to them. So if they could beat Trump when he was in office, of course they could beat Trump when they don't only just control many of the cities, but they control the whole country. So I can't see why this is going on, other than it's just this knee-jerk hysteria, and it's part of the corruption, it's part of the guilt. I think they must know that. I suppose the fear is that if somehow not only did he win, but he also managed to put in place his own little Praetorian Guard to sort things out, then they would all be in prison for life, if they're lucky. So I suppose it's that combination of guilt and the nagging fear that perhaps somehow he'll pull something out of a hat, and if he gets in charge, he will really do something. Quite remarkable to see. The only other thing is, to what extent is this just a bread and circuses distraction from real issues? Because we know that Trump made very little difference last time, other than keeping America out of a new full-blown war. How much difference would he make next time? But just having people concentrate on the Trump story allows them to get on with other things. Perhaps it conceals their horrible loss in Ukraine. It takes Americans' eyes off all sorts of other problems. That's it's an old game, isn't it? For when an elite has some sort of crisis, they create some new and exciting story for the masses to keep their attention on it. And I think there's an element of that with this, because it's a circus, isn't it? And fundamentally, it's about squabbling over who's going to run the rearrangement of the deck chairs on the Titanic.
But it's a bit of a dangerous game, though, isn't it? Because it seems to be a provocation to Trump supporters, to Middle America, to a hell of a lot of the country, and there seems to be a sort of attempt to goad them into civil disturbance. We know that they completely overlook any disturbance. So the corruption, for those that don't have cobwebs on their eyes, is overt. There has to come a point where somebody will drain the swamp, or that country's gone, which I wouldn't completely be bothered about, because that would loosen the noose around Australia's neck. But Jim, your thoughts?
Well, look, I agree with the thrust of what Nick said. One big issue that's come up right at the back of the Trump campaign is this war in Ukraine. And while a lot can't be said for this man DeSantis, the governor of Florida, he's raised it too. There's a fear, I'm sure Nick has more information than we do regarding trends in Europe. There's a fear that there's a growing resistance to this war. A lot of people don't necessarily know why, but in America, there's always been a very large movement, euphemistically from the left and the right of politics, against war. A lot of people who've taken the line of America look after America's business for whatever reason they do it. If Trump was the candidate, or is perceived to be the candidate, whether it's right or wrong, perceived to be the candidate who might take America out of that imbroglio, then I can see why he's in court now. The use of criminal charges against people is the oldest trick in the book. It's the usual thing. You never charge a person, say like a Wyszynski or something like that, with the clear indictment of why they're there. You always charge them with something else of a purely criminal nature. I agree with Nick. It looks like a sideshow, but it's not. It's obviously to silence him, and it could be out of some fear that he might do something that can't be necessarily predicted, that he might unleash forces that can't necessarily be chained up again. And this is their problem. They're now running to a timetable. And I'll finalise by taking a point that Nick made there about the system in 2008, rolling the printing presses and so on and so forth, is that there was a book written, of all things, about the Nazis, actually, by a left-wing economist called Ryman. You may have seen it. It was called Hitler's Vampire Economy. And I won't buy into the arguments that Ryman puts against fascism or whatever. But the general economic argument that some economies only exist because they find some other economy to parasite off or bleed dry or exploit or monetize its assets, this seems to be how the regime in Washington, New York now works. And the latest victim is Ukraine. and they want the assets, the food and mineral and other resources of Ukraine. It can't survive except by finding some other country to leech off. And maybe they're running out of economies to leech off. So we're in a unique period of history here. And it may well be whether he wants to do it or doesn't want to do it, or he's not this politics and not this politics. Trump may have blundered into something that he could unleash some sort of social explosion in America. Well, I hope he does. And maybe the charges are very, very foolish. They may actually light the fuse, do the Guy Fawkes. It could actually happen that way.
Well, he's sort of in a spot, though, isn't he? Because if he comes back, and let's face it, he's leading way ahead of DeSantis
He'll get
at this time for the poll. They've made a martyr of him, but he'll have no choice but to drain the swamp. And let's just hypothetically suggest he comes back 2024, becomes American president. He have a hell of a lot of work to do. Would he then offer no help to NATO and leave them, floundering in a mess of their own? I mean, that's the sort of thing I imagine he was sort of steering in that direction. The last time he was in office, he was taking too much advice from, blowflies around him. This time,
John Bolton,
my God. And even Bolton today condemned the charges against Trump, which is saying something, Now, as horrible as things are in America, in the beloved United Kingdom, you are now under a Turban Triumvirate.
Sorry to interrupt you. Before we come into the UK, can we just say one more thing about the Trump business? Yeah. You've used the word provocation, and said it's a dangerous provocation. What the Democrats are doing, it's undoubtedly a provocation, and it could turn out to be very dangerous, obviously. But on the other hand, you've got to consider: is it a provocation because they can't help themselves, and it's a sort of a side effect? It's a gamble they're taking, or is this a key part of it? It's a deliberate provocation, because let's face it, the last time when Trump was still just about president, and he effectively called his supporters out, they came out. It was the grand old Duke of York operation, marched them up to the top of the hill, marched them down again, and nothing happened, other than they were all heavily demonized. But can you imagine, considering one of the core aims of the Democrats, or probably the core aim actually of the whole thing, is the global climate warming carbon great reset thing, imposing a tyranny, on an Australian scale and worse on the USA. They can't do it if the American people are armed. Still, simple as that. And I think that already Trump's core supporters, I don't think they can win politically. So some of them may well, could well, if they're provoked enough, turn to violence. Is that a problem for the Democratic regime, or it is the opportunity they crave, on top of the regular school shootings and so on, to actually come in and take away at least the assault rifles, to make sure that their militias, whether it's Antifa, the police, or the newly politically correct reconstructed army, that they can dominate the American people? I don't know, but I think that the Democrats are crazed enough and fanatical enough to be prepared to see a lot of blood on the streets if at the end of it, the American people are effectively disarmed.
Well, it's interesting you say that, because a journalist actually put that question to the White House press secretary, that little gollywog. I've forgotten what her name is, Jean something, sounds French. She's a lesbian. And she refused to brook it. And of course, when that happens, it's almost an admission. The question was something like, will you go door to door confiscating people's weapons? Now, how that would work federally, I don't know, because a lot of these states are certainly moving to secure themselves against the most extreme aspects of wokedom, such as child mutilation, which is very important to the climate agenda. And I tell you, Nick, do you ever remember a show called Quatermass?
I do, yes.
There was an episode I remember seeing as a kid where all the youth were suddenly behaving in this really strange way, tribally, and the crux of the plot was they were being harvested by aliens, and that, to me, seems like representative of the transgender. All of them just heading towards that big light to be, harvested. It's incredible, but the potential is very much there for a civil war. And having spent so long running around the Middle East, spreading, spring revolution and Maidan, they've certainly got a method for conducting one domestically, and no compunction. A neocon is not a conservative, despite its name. A neocon is not a liberalist. A neocon is a fanatic that believes in, strip it all away, all the rest of it, in nothing but power. We should have the power, they shouldn't. The similarities between them and the Islamic fundamentalists, are only skin deep. But now, getting back to the next question, the UK is now under a Turban Triumvirate. You've got Hamza Yousaf, who is a 37-year-old Muslim, and he is leading Scotland through the vagaries of that system. You've got Leo Varadkar, who's gay, half curry, and through some power sharing deal, he's been put in charge. At the same time, you've got that Rishi Sunak. Wow, what a coincidence.
It's quite remarkable. So I've got to correct you, though, Nathan, of course, because otherwise and for that matter, if he even comes to Ireland, you'll be shot, because you've just said that the Republic of Ireland is part of the United Kingdom. No, it isn't. Varadkar is running the Republic of Ireland, and actually there's two bits of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland currently still nominally ruled by indigenous people. One is Wales, and the other is Northern Ireland, although it isn't really, because the little Parliament in Stormont is in abeyance because of the local politics. So actually, Northern Ireland is being run by England, so it's being run by Rishi Sunak. So we've got 3 of the 4 home nations, England, Ireland, Wales, and Northern Ireland, being run by brown people. One of them not, and Ireland next door also being run the same way. I don't know which one of them is worse. There was a brief moment when it was possible that Hamza Useless, as they call him in Scotland, might have turned out to be not as bad as Nicola Sturgeon when he appeared the moment he was elected, very, very friendly to the woman, Kate Forbes, who is the main front runner against him, who's actually unusually in the Scottish National Party, which is a Marxist multicultural thing. She's a hardline traditionalist. She's a fundamentalist Protestant Christian, and she's especially at odds with the SNP hierarchy over abortion and the LGBT trans thing. There's a brief moment when it appeared that Hamza Yousaf might perhaps switch, because his voting bloc is Glasgow, which is now dominated by Pakistanis. And shortly before the internal SNP election a couple of months ago, the Pakistanis' official governing body in Scotland came together with the Indian, i.e. the Hindu governing body in Scotland, and announced they could no longer support Sturgeon and the Scottish National Party because of the trans agenda in schools. And for a brief moment, it looks as though Hamza Yousaf might side with the traditionalist Muslims, who are his voter base, and the traditional Christians and normal Scots, who are a significant part of their electoral base elsewhere in Scotland. It now turns out he's not. Kate Forbes has basically been pushed back to the back benches, and one of the latest things out of the Hamza Yousaf camp is that he's supporting, and the SNP will support, and Scotland will impose abortion up until birth. i.e. cold-blooded, appalling infanticide, I mean, on a staggering scale. So certainly it appears that a lot of people said, oh, he's taken over, this means we're now run by the Muslim Brotherhood. If Scotland was run by the Muslim Brotherhood, it would not have LGBTQ plus dogma being pushed down the throats of all school kids, and it wouldn't have abortion up until birth. It would have all sorts of other things wrong with it, but it wouldn't have those things. So we've got not in Hamza Yousaf, we've not got not a hardcore Islamist, but a hardcore liberal stroke Marxist, you know, recreate the world liberal agenda. So that's what's going on there. In the end, it doesn't make that much difference. Like, we shouldn't get hooked up on the idea, oh, it's terrible because now we're run by brown people. So what? Before that, we've been run by treacherous global liberal elitists. The fact that they may be, you know, perfectly white and perfectly indigenous by blood doesn't matter. Their agenda they're pushing through is just as bad. At least when you've got a Rishi Sunak in charge, more of the public might start to think, well, should we really be run by him because he's some kind of foreigner? I think it's probably better to be run into the ground by them than run into the ground by upper class race traitors who some of the public still think are like them.
Can I ask you, Nick, a lot of people, I hear this, you know, just at general level, find it very hard to understand that the Scottish National Party isn't Scottish and isn't national, that Sinn Féin is not ourselves alone, and some of the Ulster patriots are not exactly very patriotic towards Ulster. Where do you think those movements really turned into their opposite? How did this actually happen? They seem to set off on one agenda and then they end up somewhere else. How?
And we can add to that, incidentally, that the Welsh National Party, Plaid Cymru,
yes,
although it's pretty good on the language, or has been, but on everything else, no, it's another great replacement party. I think really it's down to the 68 march through the institutions. You know, they didn't march through just a few institutions; they marched through all of them. So the IRA in the 60s was a fundamentalist Catholic organisation primarily. Certainly, and the official IRA became Marxist. So the new provisional IRA for a brief while was back to being Catholic. Then, of course, they relied for a decade or more on the East German Stasi and the KGB and the whole Soviet international operation for their military training and for their explosives and all the rest of it. So while their cadres were being trained in Czechoslovakia and East Germany and Moscow, etc., in how to make bombs and how to run ambushes, they also had political cadre training. So it became Marxist. So it was that. But it's also from below, just the whole 68 generation. There were so many people who decided that they were Marxists, the whole intellectual stratum at university, that simply they took over these parties. And the SNP was basically, it was tiny but fascist in the very earliest time, not anymore. Welsh nationalism, Saunders Lewis and others. Saunders Lewis, who founded Plaid Cymru in the 1930s, early 30s, he was a staunch admirer of Action Française. And the only thing that set Saunders Lewis and the early founders of Plaid Cymru apart from the whole of European fascism was the fact that because they were so staunchly Christian, they were also pacifist. But apart from that, they were basically 1930s European fascists. So all these parties started off that way. They were captured in the late 60s, and it's got worse ever since. And I think, first of all, it was the immense power of the Soviet Union's help to them. More recently, with the passing of the Soviet Union, the Trotskyite eternal, perpetual revolution thing, George Soros and all the rest, they're all pushing those people in the same direction. They're very ambitious for power. There's no reason for an ordinary Scottish or Irish capitalist to back parties like that. No one would. So they've got to get their support from somewhere. So the liberal elite globally has seen them, and the European Union also saw them as ways to break up the United Kingdom, which, even though they sort of had a grip on it, it's still a powerful and important, or was, nation state. You can't build an international system save on the ruins of the nation state. And these little separatist parties were very useful ways of breaking up the nation state that was the United Kingdom. And they've pretty much done it now.
Well, you're yeah. Let me get this straight in case I screw up another bit of fact. But Ireland is obviously one when it comes to its first minister.
No,
No?
you've got two. You've got two countries in Northern Ireland. The island of Ireland, but Ireland, as in the Irish Republic or era, is an independent sovereign state, still part of the European Union. It's been an independent and sovereign state since the 1930s. It was an independent state since the 1920s. Northern Ireland, Ireland was partitioned in the 1920s. So Northern Ireland is a separate state with a devolved parliament. So it's under the Crown theoretically. It's under Westminster, but it's got a dissolved parliament with a great deal of power. Except, as I say, at present that's in abeyance, because power sharing was imposed on it. This was power sharing between the nationalist, nominally Catholic community and the Protestant loyalist community. This power sharing was imposed on that primarily by the British government. But because that's now breaking down, largely because the nationalists are now electorally in the majority, so all of a sudden they're not interested in sharing power. Or no, power sharing was only there when the pro-British loyalists were a majority. Now that they're no longer, well, the British state is no longer really interested in power sharing. They want the majority now to rule the place. So therefore, it's sort of sitting, it's got no government, so it's being run by Westminster. So we recently had the unbelievable spectacle of Sinn Féin. So the political wing of the IRA, the party supposed to stand for Irishness and all the rest of it. And Sinn Féin, when they found that the combination of the Democratic Unionist Party, so the Protestant Unionist bloc, and traditionalist Catholics meant that there was no chance of imposing abortion on Northern Ireland, unlike Southern Ireland, Sinn Féin went to Westminster and begged the British Westminster government to impose abortion on Northern Ireland. So Sinn Féin will end up killing more Irish babies than Oliver Cromwell.
So Mr. Leo Varadkar is leading a party called Fine Gael. Have I pronounced?
Yes.
Fine Gael,
Fine Gael,
which stands for Tribe of Gaels. Just a tad ironic there. Okay, now viewers' question here. We got sent it on YouTube, and it's one that both of you can answer. But somebody wanted to know your opinion on Viktor Orban and his politics and his government.
Who's going to do that first then, Jim or me?
Nick first.
Okay, well, I'm banned from traveling around almost the whole of the world at present, the whole of the European Union and North America and the USA because of Viktor Orban, or at least because of the Hungarian government, because I was banned from Hungary 4 years ago after a little bit of perhaps over-enthusiastic campaign work against George Soros, strangely enough. And because I'm banned from Hungary, now that Britain's left the European Union, that's extended to a ban from the European Union. And because the United States uses the same terrorist alert system, and then I'm therefore banned from there already. I was already banned from coming to Australia, going to New Zealand, South Africa, or Canada. So I'm pretty much under house arrest on these two islands. So therefore, I should be very anti-Viktor Orban, but I'm not, because he's doing in many ways a very good job for Hungary. Could be better, but he's a damn sight better than the politicians of almost all the rest of the European Union. And he's really very, very sound on the Ukraine issue. So all there is good. On the other hand, and he's trying desperately to encourage enough Hungarians to have enough Hungarian babies to stop Hungary disappearing up its own demographic backside, in the next 50 or 60 years. He's even doing things that I was told the other day that he's nationalised the scrapyards.
That's interesting.
Sort of why? Because it's fairly obvious, actually, because by encouraging Hungarians to have lots of children, they do run the risk that they're just encouraging the gypsies, who are not Hungarian at all, to have lots of children. And yeah, I don't know what it's like in Australia, but certainly all over Europe and Britain and Hungary, the scrap business is basically run by gypsies. So by nationalising it, it makes it nothing can be sold for cash anymore. It's got to go through state things. So all of a sudden, the gypsies are deprived of one of their main cash-free black economy jobs. So a few more thousand of them will simply take their trucks and go and do scrap in the rest of Europe rather than Hungary. So all so far so good. But then on the other hand, I was told the other day that there's also a land grab from the farmers, parallel to what's going on in Holland, where the Dutch government is saying that in order to fight climate change, it's no longer just dealing with carbon, we're also now dealing with nitrogen and its use. So therefore we're going to forcibly buy large chunks of farmland in the Netherlands and pass it back to nature and take the farmers out. And Orban apparently is doing the same in parts of Hungary. So you put that together with the extremely close relationship between the Orban government and the Israeli government and the Mossad, and the man ain't perfect. You know, definitely not. It's a little bit like Putin. You know, he's not perfect. But I wish we had a Putin or even an Orban running Britain. It'd be a damn sight better than it is now.
Yeah, look, I essentially agree with that. I think that the great plus that comes out of Viktor Orban is he's pointed out by his actions that it's very easy for countries to get into things like NATO and the European Union. It's not that easy to have an alternate policy, let alone get out. And I suppose it's one of those things where he's sounding warning signals to various countries. He stalled as long as he could on the memberships of NATO, Finland and Sweden and everything like that. He's sending signals that this is not a good thing. And of course, he has kept his line of communication open with the Russians to hopefully do the deal that will end this war. So I agree with Nick. He's certainly not perfect, this fellow, but if I was a Hungarian, I'd be voting for him a lot sooner than I'd be voting for the standard fare of Hungarian politician, that's for sure. So,
yeah. Just coming on top of that, Jim, to say that Orban is in a very difficult position. It's a little bit like Vučić in Serbia. They're walking a tightrope. And if they go too far the wrong way, they know they'll probably face a coloured revolution. And they may end up swinging from a lamppost, and their country ends up utterly just as a NATO stroke EU puppet, the same as Italy, when basically they simply imposed an EU occupation government on the place. Whereas if they don't go too far, perhaps they feel, and it's probably a fairly valid decision. If they don't go too far, they don't provoke the liberal elites globally too far, they may be left to carry on as they are, because coloured revolutions are inherently dangerous and so on. So tightrope walking, you can't blame the man when he does things that we'd rather he didn't do.
I agree.
Now, to change pace a bit here, I notice you've been doing regular appraisals of your old mate Tommy Robinson.
Tommy!
Yes.
And at times I've been at a bit of a loss because you can say some approving things when he appears to be moving in a acceptable direction, and then you can come back on him. But I thought that it was already conclusively proved the bastard was a complete Zio grifter.
Oh yeah, it's absolutely conclusively proved. And if anyone doesn't know that, then there's a whole essay on it on a selection of my sort of attack and explanation articles, and also a very good essay about what to do if you're ever arrested on the standalone website altrightnotright.com. So yeah, there's a whole thing there about Tommy Robinson and the English Defence League, and he's completely a Zionist set up and run agent of influence. Right? There's no doubt about that. But if you went back, not even to the EDL days of sort of 2009, 2013, even more recently, apart from talking about Islam, on everything else, Tommy was pure poison. So English Defence League rallies, the flags flown, there was a few Union flags, very few. The majority of the flags flown were the Pride flag and the Israeli flag. That was the agenda. And at that stage, he was heavily pushing the whole of the British sort of working class right towards a pro-LGBT and pro-Zionist line. He was also heavily pushing there's nothing wrong with immigration, nothing wrong with multiculturalism, nothing wrong with miscegenation. It's all to do with love. Doesn't matter that they're black and they're half black, all the rest of it. The only problem was Islam. And he's radically changed his position now. Radically. Oh, he was pro-abortion as well. Complete liberal, apart from on Islam. Radically changed. So he's primarily on Telegram these days, but everything he's doing, he's now anti, not just the trans thing, but he's pretty much anti the whole LGBT thing. He's anti-abortion. He's talking about Christianity and tradition. He's obviously anti-woke, and all the rest of it. And he's even moved from talking about just Islamification to talking about immigration. He's opposing it all. He's been over in Ireland a lot, trying to whip up support to oppose, particularly, it's mainly African immigration into Ireland, and most of them are Muslims. They're either Christians or animists. So there's this radical change. So I've been sort of pointing this out, encouraging it a bit, and goading also to say, well, he's right on all these things, and he's also, very important, come out against two other things. Sorry, this huge change. 3 years ago, he was an absolute shill for the COVID crisis and for vaccines. Now he's bang out there with all the anti-vaxxers and we've got to get justice and all the rest of it. Never again. And he's also completely against the war in Ukraine. He's spot on everything. He's even occasionally attacking likes of George Soros and so on. So he's spot on almost everything, but he's never mentioned Iran. He's never mentioned Israel. So apart from that, tremendous. So what is the change? So I was wondering, in fact, has he simply, have the old paymasters ditched him? And is he, in fact, now being paid by the Russians? Because he switched on so many things to a position which should be more, cozier for them. What is going on? And the main analysis I did the other day, Nathan, on my Telegram channel. Viewers, please come and join me on Telegram. It's t.me/Nick Griffin. I did quite a big piece about him on there the other day, because it suddenly dropped into place. Tommy has not changed masters at all. It's just that his masters have changed their position on things. It's not because they've suddenly decided to love us. No, but because geopolitics have changed. And the crux of it is that shows that he's still with the same people. Is he's still promoting Abiy Yemeni, who's a...
Yes, we know him very well.
Familiar with him.
Yemeni is. He's still promoting him. And he turned up in Denmark the other day at the Danish Parliament and so on with the Danish right-wingers, and in with the Danish Free Press Society run by a chap called Lars Hedegaard, who is in my original expose of the EDL as one of the key players of the US neocon sort of and stroke Zionist special operation to influence nationalism in Britain and beyond through, among others, Tommy Robinson. So Tommy is still in bed with these people, but what's changed? Well, quite simply, he's a Likud man. He's not working for the Mossad or whatever. This is actually specifically a Likud agent of Operation Influence. And the Likud and the Netanyahu government are now basically in a civil war with the Jewish liberals, with the Zionist liberals, and they're up against the globalist, internationalist, deep state ideas in various ways. They're a gang of hardcore Israeli fascist, ultra Zionist fanatics. Doesn't really fit in anymore. Greater Zion wants, among other things, the liberalization of the whole of the Middle East, and actually having Israel running around as a load of crazed religious extremists doesn't feed into moderating and softening Islam and all the rest of it. It's no longer particularly convenient. The Likud government has the same fundamental original sin as Vladimir Putin, that they are against LGBTQ+ for their kids. Yes, we know that the whole trans thing, if you look into who created the whole trans thing, you'll find people who have far closer connections with Benjamin Netanyahu and Abiy Yemeni than with us. We know that, but nevertheless, that's their thing, and it's got to be imposed on the whole world. And it's fundamental. The whole trans thing is it's like a gateway drug for transhumanism. So it's absolutely crucial in the twisted minds of the Klaus Schwabs and all the rest of them that LGBTQ is imposed everywhere in the world. And the Likud government doesn't want to do that. And then even more important than that, I think, in the decisions, it's very clear that Netanyahu who was not that long ago up for, total war in the Middle East and all the rest of it, knowing he had America on side and that America had the power to make sure that they won. And I think that Netanyahu, and there was an article about this, I think it was in Forward and in one of which is an American-based liberal left newspaper. And there was also a matching one in one of the Israeli papers, which, to my shame, I can't remember which one it was, saying that Netanyahu and the Likud are now trying to hedge their bets by cozying up to Russia enough because they know that American power is basically finished, that the rapprochement between Saudi Arabia and Iran. Just the other day, it was the day before yesterday, it was announced that Brazil, that's the biggest economy in the whole of South America, has now done a deal to buy oil in local currency, never in dollars. So this is so crucial that Netanyahu and Likud are looking and thinking, American power's finished. There's a new world shaping up. Therefore, we are going to have a relationship with powerful people in that new world, or we are going to lose our perfect God-given blah, blah, blah state. So therefore, they are not on side with the war in Ukraine. And you put that together with their position on LGBTQ, and they are now sinners who've got to be got rid of. And the protests against Netanyahu and Likud are a coloured revolution attempt being run by the people who always run coloured revolutions. So as part of the pushback, well, these articles said that, as another factor here, they said that the people who've been running the likes of Tommy Robinson, they didn't mention him by name, but they're saying that basically the agents of influence that they have all over the world, they've decided that the pushback that's coming against the whole woke business and against the trans business is so huge, and against mass immigration as well. This pushback in the West is so huge that it's vital for them to put their agents of influence leading that pushback, so it doesn't spin on and get out of control. So the minute I read that, I understood that is what is going on with Tommy Robinson. So I still attack him for that, but at the same time, if we've now got the position that a hugely powerful section of, let's use a simplistic phrase, international Jewry, which was 3-4 years ago pushing eternal wars and war against Russia, LGBTQ plus to the max, and mass immigration in our countries, if they're now not doing so, which they're not, and if in fact they're going to be doing the other thing, be a bit churlish and perhaps foolish of us to carry on obsessing too much over them, instead of just concentrating on being ready to ride the wave that these people are going to create for their own ends.
So just before I throw to Jim, I'll just make a comment. So we've determined that Tommy Robinson is an influencer, not a and into the blowback against the US is Biden playing footsies with Iran. Saudi Arabia is now in the oncoming weeks shutting down oil barrel production.
Yep.
Which is necessarily going to hurt, well, it'll hurt Australia, etc., but it'll hurt America deeply. And just before I throw to Jim, everything you've said applies equally to Paul Golding, I take it.
Yep.
Yeah, right.
Instead, I've been told by friends, comrades in Sweden, Spain and France, that everything I've said about this in my analysis, it clicks with them, that they see exactly the same thing in their countries too, with the same sort of people.
And Avi Yemeni is... I was just going to say a hideous poison dwarf, but do go on.
Yeah, well, we know him quite well. He's the great campaigner against the vaccines and so on, while previously being the great advocate of the anti-Islam crusade. But not quite as pronounced, but what you're saying resonates here too. We had an ultra, our Conservative Party is called the Liberals, as you know, and we had an ultra-Liberal who set up his own party called the Conservative Party. And a couple of months ago, he wrote a scathingly condemnatory article of the war in Ukraine. And somewhat from an establishment point of view that this is going to undermine us. But aside from that, there was some very prescient and clever comment about what this war otherwise signifies. Also, too, we had small groups of rampant anti-Islamist groups, a bit like the EDL. One of the former leaders of one of those groups has now dropped out of it all completely. And while he's a very mixed up and probably disturbed person, I won't name him out of deference, is now almost styling himself as a pseudo-fascist. And they're not alone. Also, too, we have a reactionary small c Conservative Party here called One Nation. And New South Wales leader of it, an ardent multiracialist, multiculturalist and everything else, called Mark Latham, is now trying to co-opt the anti-transgender campaign for his own purposes. And we have noticed here too that on that particular issue, we mentioned LGBTQI and the overall agenda behind it. I'm sure you agree there's been certain wedges driven into this. Sometimes the LGB are now divided against the TQI+. Also, the feminists, who are completely from the outside, are now divided against LGB. And we also find now there are a lot of women who are chasing the lesbians and also attacking LGBT and QI and the whole lot, you know. So it's turned into an amazing brawl. And it might be a lot clearer in the UK. It's certainly a large mess here. But we are seeing some of those similar phenomena to what you're pointing out. Yes, definitely.
Yeah. Well, the revolution will eat itself. It always.
Basically, yeah.
It its children.
Yes. Very much.
We've certainly crammed a lot in here. What's your time like, Nick?
I could do with finishing, if not on the hour, no later than 10 minutes thereafter.
Oh, I'm fine.
If that's okay with you.
That's why I'm asking. I just wanted to quickly touch on something that I think is a great impediment to the growth of nationalism in Australia, and I covered it, or at least I grazed across it in that article I sent you, and that is the chauvinism that has been exhibited by young people that 5 years ago, you know, were playing with their tennis balls and playing with themselves for all I know. And now they've come in and social media allows everybody and his, pet hamster to have an opinion. And they've created these blocks. You know, they call themselves nationalists, and they utterly will not listen to anybody older than 30, etc. And they're horrid to deal with. They're the most, Well, have you experienced this phenomena?
Okay, Boomer.
Yeah.
Yes. Absolutely so. Now, to a degree, it's natural. You know, all young men, they're designed to rebel against their elders and so on. But of course, their rebellion against their elders should be against the elders in power, and not the dissident elders, you know, the likes of us. But there you go. It's a sort of a bit of they have no chance of rebelling against the elders in power, whereas they have a chance, at least in their heads and some subconsciouses as well, of taking this mighty movement, you know, and all the influence away from the likes of us. So there's a little victory of the young against the old, and to a degree that's natural. But then the scale of this thing, I'm sure that it's artificially encouraged by various agents of influence for various different people, because self-evidently breaking the chain of ideas and experience between the older nationalists and the young leaves the young very, very vulnerable. So constantly, certainly in Britain, first of all with National Action, and more recently with Patriotic Alternative, this, and they're old, they failed, they're responsible for all this mess, don't listen to the boomers. It's been used to encourage these lads to think they can go out and do the most moronic, stupid and dangerous things. And as a result, they end up in prison. National Action had, I think, about 130 members total at its height. That was the biggest it ever got. About 25 of them are now in prison. And it's a catastrophic casualty rate. And PA is shaping up to be the same thing. And all those ones in prison, virtually to a man, but myself and others spoke to at some stage and said, we told them, what you're doing, here's where it ends up, this is where it's wrong, this is how dangerous it is. And they said, fuck off, you old fool. You wait to see where we are in 3 years' time. And when they were told you'll be in prison in 3 years' time, now wait and see, we'll show you how it's done. So it's very, very dangerous, it's very stupid. But it's not all of them. It's the noisiest ones, of course. Yeah, they're like a bunch of little hairless chihuahuas. So they run around and they yap and they make a lot of noise and they slag people off. But certainly in Britain, I think now the majority of the youngsters who've given up on the idea of a standard, steady plod to power electorally and so on, they're doing their own sort of cultural things about folklore and their own local groups. And they're not down this, crazed banzai charge neo-Nazism, which condemns all of us. And quite a lot of them, come back to me. So I've done a number of shows a bit like this. I did one with Kate Fanning, who's a girl in her woman in her early 30s, who's come out of the anti-grooming campaigns and so on. That's a significant figure. I was on her show the other day, and the comments were wall to wall, pro, supportive, and appreciative of my experience and so on. And the little handful of hairless chihuahuas were nowhere to be seen. So it's not to be worried about too much, but it certainly is. It's a very dangerous and wicked thing, because the likes of me and Jim and you, we've been around the block. We've seen it all, and we can stop these youngsters making a lot of mistakes, not least because why on earth should they make the same mistakes that we did? To make different mistakes is fair enough. To make the same mistakes as us, that really would be deeply stupid.
One thing I can say, if I can crib a line from Chairman Mao, he once said that if the revolutionaries rebel against the reactionaries, it's a good day. But if the reactionaries rebel against the revolutionaries, he said, you're going to have a disaster on your hands. And if I could paraphrase him a little, I think actually what's happened here, a lot of misthought out ideas. It has been a rebellion of reactionaries. I'll mention something from my own personal experience. I can go right back to, say, 1984. And there was a very, very well-known, legendary Australian conservative called Eric Butler, an absolute legend. He ran the Australian League of Rights. And unfortunately, he took a wrong road over the issue of immigration. And we had some meetings, nationalists had meetings to discuss what to say about this. And speaking for myself, I was 28, 29 years old, and I felt an enormous sense, a massive sense of trepidation that I was going to raise my hand against a man who was actually a legend. And I thought about it with a lot of, I can't put it into words. In the end, we raised the questions against the League's line on immigration. Now, I'm happy to say the story has a happy ending, because 4 years later, when the Australian Senate launched a massive attack upon Eric Butler and then upon other nationalist organisations, we actually arranged, I call it a secret conflab, and we decided to end the whole argument because we'd in one sense ended up in the same boat. But what I'm saying is that there's always been, I think, amongst people who are a little bit more mature up here, if you have to say something against an older person or raise issues against another movement or something, it has to be done in the right way. But what we're seeing, and coming back to your point, is that's not what's happening. And therefore that alerts me to the idea that there could well be other players involved in this who are not who are dealing from an entirely false deck of cards. And it doesn't just involve neo-Nazis, it involves some other groups too, that there's been a lot of generationalism, and that's not a good thing. It's actually an evil thing. I suppose it does put more obligations back on us to be more open, more reasonable, more communicable, and all the rest of it. I had a meeting, I won't say where I went, with a very decent young man only the other day who was working on certain outcomes, and he asked me direct questions. I gave him direct answers, and I think that's the way it has to be. But those groups that are obviously inflamed and incited, and as you said, you get a high attrition rate, people going to prison, people being arrested, that's when you know you're dealing with something that's just not right.
Yeah.
Well, we know that exists because when I was arrested, it was actually after my sentence was passed. The journalist who just happened to, of course, organise my arrest with his original article is a guy called Nick McKenzie. Now, he is
dirty.
He is
dirty.
Yeah, ASIO all the way.
Yeah, MI5, the same story.
Yeah.
And I'll never forget, in that article, he dropped in a line by, and we know from our inside expose on the National Socialist Network that Dr. Jim Saleam and Nathan Sykes are considered old jokes, blah, blah. I think, okay, I know you're a stooge, but why would you throw that gratuitous little bit in there? And
look, look, in a crazy place, I'm happy to be a joke. You know, like, it might help people, you know. I hope so. But
I'll also say, I think that Mark Collette's dirty. It's, you know, I know it's a sensitive button for you, but how could this guy, who had, let's say, the benefit of your counsel, and it's not that we haven't seen that before, but be so stubbornly hell-bent on a course that is going to, you know, crash every passenger in the carriage?
Because he's an egotistical monster.
Is that all?
Yes. That's just, he's a thoroughly spoilt brat, brought up badly in a loving home, but he was spoilt as a child. He's been spoilt ever since. You know, we had all sorts of trouble in the BNP with people hating him, and I understood entirely where they were coming from. You know, he did various things. He treated working class people, especially, particularly badly. And the problem there was saying to people, look, you know, yes, I understand these problems. They had to be dealt with constitutionally and in a normal way. And the minute you get a gang of people in the party saying that individual, doesn't matter who it is, as a party leader, Jim, you'll understand this. If a group of people in the party are allowed to say, unless you change something that we don't like, we will cause trouble. We will tear things apart. If you give way to that, then straight away you've either got anarchy, because all the groups within the party try and do the same thing, or the party's chosen, elected, however it is, proper leadership no longer runs things. It's run by a mob. And that was my problem. As the more Collett's flaws showed when he was in the BNP, the problem wasn't that I didn't feel Collett had flaws and I couldn't see them or whatever. It was that the people demanding something being done about them were constantly going about it the wrong way, in a way that if this was allowed, then, you know, the show's basically over. It has to be done through the proper channels. But Collett was a menace to himself and people around him then. He's talented. You know, he's built Patriotic Alternative. You know, they've been under the same sort of, or not exactly the same, but to a fair degree, they've been under the same cosh of deplatforming and all the rest of it as the rest of us. But he's still, you know, built something quite significant. And unfortunately now, because of where it's going to end very badly indeed, and probably sooner rather than later. We've got the position that the entire next generation of nationalists in Britain have now gone through, or at least been part of that operation. So they are all tarred with that brush. Going to be really, really, really dangerous. So, you know, it's most unfortunate. But to be in that position, he's attracted thousands of young people. That's not exactly difficult because he's not demanding anything of them. They don't have to join. They don't have to pay money. They don't have any organizational discipline. They don't have to get out and do work on the streets and stand in elections the way our people used to do. It's mainly, hiding in their bedrooms. But nevertheless, he's involved thousands of them. It's quite successful because he is quite a capable individual. But he's drastically flawed by his ego and his arrogance. And I think he's been bought and paid for a long, long time ago. He's another one of the leaders to death and destruction and darkness that we thought about, seen and so on for a long, long time. On a very small scale, but he's going to lead thousands of young British nationalists to a very dark place where they're damaged, not just individually, but also politically damaged. The movement will suffer from what's going on with PA for many, many years to come. But the one good thing I'll say, an awful lot of youngsters have seen through him, an awful lot. He's constantly surrounded by 15-year-olds. You've got a man now in his 40s who, I know this isn't some kind of smear, something which is not true. He makes a point of playing video games for hours on end with 15-year-olds, publicly and openly, and screaming when they lose and letting down and so on. It's almost bizarre. But the minute lads get to 19, 20, 21, 95% of them see through him and walk away and get on to better things. And perhaps there's a point at which, in those 15, 16, 17-year-old years, some of what PA has done and said has radicalized and educated those youngsters in a good way. Not all black and dark. And the ones who got out of it quickly enough will be better for it.
Yeah, a couple of people I know, have had, I'll just say some dealings with PA. I won't say online how they did, but they found some of the members very reasonable people, very good people, and they hope that they will obviously move on in the right way. And that's often the trouble, I suppose, with all sorts of organisations. What can you say? Australia, of course, we've been the subject here of an endless process, almost of engineered wrecking operations. We had our own version of the Robinson movement, a so-called patriot movement. We had a internationally connected so-called alt-right, and then there were neo-Nazi offshoots that went in one direction, and then there was something else that went in others. And each time there's a loss of potential people. A lot of young people are brought in and then thrown out of it. We get a lot of information from various sources about those things. And I don't regard it as very positive. If we said that a couple of thousand young people have been gone through different groups between 2016, I doubt there's about 200 of those left. And of the other 1,800, probably 4/5 are permanently lost. That's not a good outcome. And whether there's an engineering factor in there, I'd suspect there's a little bit of that. But you can always, what's that old saying? You can always rely on, in a certain school, foolishness to come to the fore. I can't remember what the saying was. I think with respect to our English comrades, it might have been something from those English public schools of the 19th century. You introduce some element of foolishness and it's bound to become popular. But
I think so.
Yeah, something like that. And we get a very bad outcome. But if we look at the continental European scene, I don't know if you agree with this, Nick, or maybe you've got alternate information. A lot of the actors are far more serious, far more dedicated, with longer histories of organisational continuities. They seem to do a little better than the Anglophone world does. Do you agree with that?
I think so. And I think it's probably partly because, the Five Eyes, the whole sort of the intel thing and so on, it's so coordinated. So tricks that the FBI have used and learned and developed for dealing with, radical threats to the status quo, they've been passed on to MI5, etc., and vice versa. Whereas if the Italian state or the German state, they're a bit more limited to their own little circle. So I think we probably get it worse than others. On the other hand, I know from long-term contact with Roberto Fiore in Italy that the movement there has been plagued with exactly the same sort of tricks, exactly the same sort of playbook. So again, it's partly because we're, for linguistic reasons and cultural reasons, not so close to those people. A lot of what's going on, we miss the nuances. So they have it too. Overall, I'd agree that they are more serious. They're certainly more genuinely intellectual. They're more rooted in their own traditions than we are, and they're probably less less radically cut off from a significant part of the mainstream of their society than we are. You know, Roberto Fiore, I've seen him in the European Parliament. He passed a member of the Italian, one of the conservative parties, or even a socialist, and would stop and talk with them. You know, there's a complete the cordon sanitaire around the likes of me and you. You know, there's no comparison. You know, we're in an iron cage compared with what some of the Europeans are. Can I just come back, by the way, on that to say, I don't want to go back onto the PA thing at all. But if any, especially British viewers, are thinking, well, you know, perhaps this is sour grapes, you know, because Nixon old has been, and you know, Mark says so successful and so on. Again, go back to that site, altright.com, because as well as the essay on Tommy Robinson and the EDL, there's also one on Patriotic Alternative, which sets out exactly the reasons why I'm justified in saying what I'm saying and how dangerous it is. And again, I come back to the fact the most important document of all there, I think it's one of the most important I've ever written, and I've written millions of words in my time and published them, is the document Arrested, What to Do If You Are Arrested. And the crux of it is whatever you say nothing, but there's a lot more to it than that. And there's no one involved in the nationalist cause as a traditionalist Christian, involved in the anti-COVID things, anti-war activist. There's nobody who should not read that document, because it can keep you out of prison. Simple as that. It's not just written by me. It's written originally by the core of that document comes from the paramilitaries on both sides in Northern Ireland. And then it's been refined by working with pro-life campaigners who've been arrested and all the rest by the police. It's been gone over by sympathetic solicitors. It really is an important document. It's done by teamwork. I know that the legal system over in Australia is not quite the same as here, but again, I'm sure that it'll be very, very similar. And it's a great starting point. No one else has done anything like it.
You don't mind if we link it on our Telegram?
Please do. Please do.
I think so. I've heard of the document, and with respect, Nick, unfortunately, I haven't got around to reading it. So I give you my word of honour as a non-gentleman that I will do that.
Well, I'm sure you know the score anyway, Jim. So
I do indeed. I do. I've sat there, and some of the words I'm alleged to have said, I find it amazing. And you're just sitting there like that, and you're having long. We have men with an inquiry in the Supreme Court here in New South Wales at the moment. Some Croatian migrants. Their confessions are this long, and they never said a word.
Yeah. Well, I do actually have a copy of the document. I collect all your stuff, Nick. I keep a extensive archive of relevant material. All right, gentlemen. Well, I suppose it's breakfast time in Ireland.
It is indeed. I'm not in Ireland, Nathan. I'm in Northern Ireland.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. We have to be very particular on that.
Yeah, you too, bloody Northern Ireland.
To give you an idea, Nathan, of how I absolutely forgive you for not getting it. To give you an idea of how complex and how minute the detail is that can say one thing for another. They used to, or they still might, the gangs of rough thugs in one community or the other, they'd stop a young person in the street and just say, recite your alphabet. Because you go A, B, C, D, G, and that tells them nothing. The minute you say the next letter, if you say H, you're from the Nationalist Catholic side. If you say H, you're a prod. Or for that matter, if you refer to Northern Ireland, you're a loyalist. You refer to the north of Ireland, you're a Republican. It's quite remarkable. It's very, very complex. So I forgive you, Nathan, for being a long, long way away, not quite getting it.
And what was it all for, though? What was it all for? Indeed, so 800 years they fought to get the Brits out. And I believe that the English aristocracy had no business, and the English elite had no proper business in Ireland whatsoever. But for 800 years they fought to get the Brits out, only for the people, the ideological and political descendants of those people to say, isn't it great the Brits are out? Now we'll bring in hundreds upon thousands of Africans and Arabs and all the rest of it. What on earth was it all for?
That's the big question, isn't it?
Well, gentlemen, a lively discussion. Thank you, Nick. Thank you, Jim. And I'm sure we'll speak again soon.
Sure we will.
Good night.
Right.